Arizona Badlands, summer of 1884. I'm begging you, the battered woman choked out, the noose cutting deeper into her bruised throat. Her swollen eyes dropped toward the revolver on Elias Vance's hip. Just do it. Elias went deathly pale. His hand trembled as he raised the Colt not at her, but at the rope above her head. The gunshot shattered the canyon. The rope snapped, and Elias caught her before she struck the ground. But the smell of gunpowder dragged him back to the battlefield. His entire body convulsed as he clutched her and screamed, "No more. Please make it stop." Who was this condemned woman, and could a broken cowboy save her without losing his mind completely? Stay with us, subscribe to the channel, and let the story begin. The sun in the Badlands did not just shine. It punished. It beat down on the cracked earth like a hammer on an anvil. Elias Vance rode slow. He never rushed his gelding. Rushing out here meant making mistakes. And mistakes usually ended in bleached bones scattered across the red dirt. He was tracking a stray Mustang, a young roan that got spooked by a diamondback 2 days prior. Elias had patience. It was the one good thing the cavalry had left him. That and a deep, aching craving for absolute quiet. Out here, there were no commanding officers, no bugle calls, just the wind, the dust, and the steady rhythm of hooves. Elias crested a ridge of jagged sandstone. The valley below was a bowl of heat shimmers. At first glance, nothing moved. But Elias had a scout's eyes. Something was wrong. He felt it in his gut before his brain caught up. A dark shape hung out of place near the dry wash. A dead cottonwood tree stood alone in the basin. Its branches were twisted and bare, reaching up into the blue sky like broken fingers. And from the thickest, lowest branch, a rope dropped down. Elias spurred his horse. Just a gentle nudge. He kept his breathing steady. But his jaw tightened as he rode closer. The dark shape resolved into a figure. A person. A woman. Her toes were barely scraping the dirt. They had tied her hands behind her back with coarse twine. The rope around her neck was taut, holding her upright. But it wasn't snapping tight enough to break her neck. It was a cruel, calculated setup, a slow death. They wanted her to suffer. They wanted the panic to exhaust her. They wanted her to beg and break before the end came. That was Thaddeus Blackwood's signature. Treat a human life like a stubborn weed. Yank it out slow so the roots know exactly who is in charge. Elias slid off his horse. His boots hit the dust with a soft thud. He did not run. Running spooks the dying. He walked steady and deliberate. He left his Winchester rifle in the leather scabbard. He hated guns. He had not drawn his Colt revolver in 3 years. He had sworn to the empty desert sky that he never would again. Weapons only broke things. They tore flesh and shattered minds. They never put anything back together. He stepped into the thin, useless shade of the dead tree. The woman was badly battered. Her simple cotton dress was torn, plastered to her skin with sweat and red dust. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her eyes were swollen shut. But she heard his boots crunching against the gravel. She forced her eyes open, just a sliver. She looked at Elias. She did not see a savior. She just saw another man. And out here in the territory, men usually meant pain. She tried to swallow. There was no water left in her. She looked down at the heavy gun belt strapped to his thigh. Then she looked back up at his face. She knew what was coming. The sun was going to cook her alive. The pain in her shoulders was tearing her apart. Her chest heaved. It was a terrible sound, a wet, ragged noise of pure exhaustion. "I'm begging you," she whispered. The words were barely there. They sounded like dry leaves scraping across a tombstone. Dot, just do it. She wanted the bullet. She wanted it over. She was asking him to kill her. Elias froze. The air left his lungs. He stared at her face. Behind the bruises and the dirt, it was a face that deserved respect. A face that had clearly held out against monsters until her body simply gave out. He had to act. He could not reach the knot. It was tied too high on the branch. He could not climb the dead wood without shaking the tree and strangling her in the process. He had exactly one option. His right hand dropped to his hip. His fingers brushed the cold iron of the Colt. His stomach turned violently. He drew the heavy revolver. The metal felt wrong in his grip. Too heavy. Too familiar. He thumbed the hammer back. The mechanical click echoed loudly in the quiet canyon. He aimed at the thick hemp rope right above her head. He did not breathe. He just squeezed the trigger. The gunshot ripped the sky wide open. The rope snapped instantly. The woman dropped like a stone. Elias threw his gun into the dirt. He lunged forward. He caught her waist just before she hit the hard earth. The heavy impact drove him down to his knees in the dust. Then the smell of the burnt gunpowder hit his nose. It filled his nostrils. It coated the back of his throat. Acrid, bitter. Suddenly the canyon was gone. The bright desert sun vanished. Elias trembled. It started in his hands. Then violent shakes took over his broad shoulders. He lost his mind. He was not in the Badlands anymore. He was back in the bloody mud of Gettysburg. He heard the deafening roar of cannons. He heard the screaming of boys in blue and gray being torn apart. He felt the hot, sticky blood of his friends on his hands. He could not breathe. The panic was a massive physical weight, crushing his ribs. He was drowning in the memory of the violence. He clutched the unconscious woman tighter against his chest. He rocked back and forth in the dirt. His eyes were wide open, terrified and unseeing. "No more," he gasped out, his voice breaking. "No more. Stop, please." He was begging the ghosts to leave him be. It took a long time. Maybe 2 minutes, maybe 15, slowly. The dry smell of sagebrush and dust replaced the gunpowder. The heat of the Arizona sun chased away the cold, damp chill of the battlefield. Elias blinked rapidly. The red rocks came back into focus. The sky was blue again. He looked down at his arms. The woman was entirely still. Her breathing was shallow, but she was breathing. The thick rope had left an ugly, angry purple bruise all the way around her throat. Elias swallowed hard. His mouth was dry as bone. He forced his hands to stop shaking. He carefully reached up and untied the ruined piece of rope from her neck. He pulled it away and threw it into the brush like a venomous snake. He looked at her bruised face. He did not know her name. He did not know why Thaddeus Blackwood wanted her dead, but he knew one thing for certain. "You are not livestock." Elias whispered to her. His voice was rough, but incredibly gentle. The quiet canyon listened to him. "No one has the right to stamp a brand on you. Nobody." He adjusted his grip, supporting her head. "You're breathing," he told her unconscious form. "That means you own yourself, not them. Your life belongs to you." It was a simple truth. But out here, in a land ruled by greed and iron, simple truths were the first things men threw away. The rich looked at the poor. The powerful looked at the weak. And they only saw property. Elias despised it. Every human being had a right to stand tall. He gathered her up in his arms. She was incredibly light. He stood up, his knees popping in protest against the heavy burden. Elias walked over to his horse. He secured her carefully across the saddle, making sure she was stable. He did not look back at the dead cottonwood tree. He did not look down at the Colt revolver lying in the dirt. He left the gun right where it fell. He took the reins and started walking. He had a human life to mend. That was the only kind of work worth doing anymore. The ride back was a quiet kind of torture. The sun finally broke and dipped below the jagged rim of the canyon. It left behind a bruised purple sky. The desert cooled fast. It always did. The heat bled out of the rocks, replaced by a deep biting chill. Elias walked the entire way. He let the horse carry the woman. She was still unconscious. Her breathing was a shallow, ragged rasp that tore at the quiet evening. He kept one hand resting on the saddle horn. He kept his eyes on the horizon. He did not want to think about the gun he had left in the dirt. His cabin sat tucked into a fold of the canyon. You could not see it from the main trail. You had to know what you were looking for. It was a sturdy thing, built from cedar logs, river stones, and stubbornness. A small creek trickled behind it, the only green thing for 10 miles. A young boy was waiting on the porch. Micah, he was 14, maybe 15. Tall, all elbows and knees. He had dark skin and watchful eyes. He was an orphan from a freedmen's settlement down south. Elias had found him sleeping in a barn 2 winters ago. They never talked much about it. Micah just stayed. He worked hard. He understood horses. He understood silence. Micah stood up as Elias walked into the clearing. The boy saw the woman draped over the saddle. He didn't ask questions. He didn't panic. He just stepped off the porch and took the horse reins. "Get the water boiling," Elias said. His voice was gravelly. Micah nodded. He tied the horse to the hitching post and ran inside. Elias reached up. He gathered the woman in his arms. She was so frail it scared him. He carried her through the front door. The cabin smelled of wood smoke, dried sage, and old leather. It was safe. It was entirely his. He laid her down on his own bed in the corner. He pulled the heavy wool blanket over her legs. Micah came back with a basin of hot water and a clean rag. Who did it? Micah asked quietly. Blackwood's men. Micah's face tightened. Everyone knew Thaddeus Blackwood. You didn't have to meet the man to know his shadow. Get the yarrow from the jar, Elias told him, and the willow bark. We need to bring her fever down. Elias sat on the edge of the bed. He wrung out the hot rag. He hesitated. His hands were large, knuckled, scarred, and calloused from years of gripping reins and rifle stocks. They were hands built for rough work. He looked at the angry purple trench, dug into the woman's pale neck. He took a slow breath. He forced his hands to be steady. He pressed the warm, damp cloth against the raw skin. The woman flinched. A sharp, pained sound escaped her lips, but she didn't wake. Elias worked slowly. He cleaned the dirt and dried blood from her face. He cleaned the cuts on her lips. He moved with absolute precision. He treated her the way he treated a spooked colt. No sudden movements. No heavy pressure. Just steady, quiet care. Micah brought the crushed herbs. Elias mixed them into a poultice. He applied it to her throat. Is she going to make it? Micah asked. She's breathing, Elias said. As long as you're breathing, you've got a fighting chance. Wrapped a clean strip of white cotton around her neck to hold the medicine in place. He stood up. He washed his hands in the basin. The water turned a pale, dusty pink. It was near midnight when she finally woke. The cabin was dark, lit only by the low embers in the hearth. Elias was sitting in a wooden chair across the room. He was awake. He was always awake. Sleep was a luxury he rarely afforded himself. The ghosts were too loud when he closed his eyes. He heard the rustle of the blanket. He looked over. She was sitting up, pushed back into the corner of the bed. Her knees were pulled to her chest. Her eyes were wide, frantic in the dim light. She was looking around the room like a trapped animal, calculating an escape route. Her hand went to her throat. She felt the bandage. You're safe, Elias said. He didn't move from his chair. He kept his hands open, resting on his knees. Let her see he was unarmed. She snapped her head toward his voice. She squinted. Her breathing picked up, fast and shallow. Panic, where am I? She asked. Her voice was a broken whisper. It hurt her just to speak. My cabin, south of the ridge, Elias said softly. You're safe here. Nobody knows this place. She stared at him. She remembered the heat, the rope, the terrible pressure in her head. And she remembered the tall man in the dust. You shot the rope, she whispered. I did. You didn't kill them. No, she let out a shaky breath. She relaxed her shoulders. Just a fraction. Why, which part? Elias asked. Why didn't you kill them? They were right there. Elias looked at the dying fire. The orange light flickered across his scarred face. I don't kill men anymore. I've seen enough blood to fill a river. I'm done adding to it. She processed that. It was strange. Men in this territory settled things with lead. Always. My name is Josephine, she said. Josie, Elias. Josie leaned her head back against the log wall. She was exhausted. Her body felt like it had been put through a mill. They wanted my land, Josie said. Her voice cracked. I have a deed. My father left it to me. It has the only deep water well in the valley. Blackwood wants it for his cattle. He told me to sign it over. And you said no? I said no. Josie looked at him. Her eyes were fiercely bright despite the bruises. I am building a school on that land for the kids in the mining camps, for the native kids pushed off the reservation. Blackwood laughed at me. He said education is wasted on livestock. Elias felt a cold anger knot in his chest. He said that. Yes, Josie touched her bandaged neck. He said I was just a woman, that I didn't have the right to own anything, let alone teach. Elias stood up. He walked over to the small table and poured a tin cup of fresh water from the pitcher. He brought it to her. He didn't hand it to her directly. He set it on the small stool beside the bed. He respected her space. Drink, he said. Josie picked up the cup with shaking hands. She drank. The water was cold. It felt like absolute salvation on her torn throat. A person is not property. Elias said. His voice was low. It carried the weight of a heavy stone. It doesn't matter what you look like. It doesn't matter where you come from. Blackwood looks at the world and sees things he can buy or break. He's wrong. Josie lowered the cup. She looked at this strange, quiet man, a man who refused to kill, but risked his life to cut her down. Thank you, she whispered. Get some sleep, Josie, Elias said. He turned and walked back to his chair in the corner. Nobody is going to hurt you here. I promise you that. Josie lay back down. The bed was rough. The wool blanket scratched her chin. But for the first time in a week, she closed her eyes and did not feel afraid. She felt respected. She felt human. 3 days passed. The desert did not care about the drama of men. The sun rose. The sun set. The wind blew the red dust across the hard pan. Josie healed quickly. Her body was resilient. The terrible bruising around her neck began to fade to a sickly yellow. Her voice came back, though it carried a permanent, raspy edge, a souvenir from Thaddeus Blackwood. She could not sit still. The cabin was too small. The quiet was too loud. She needed to move. She needed to feel useful. On the 4th morning, Elias rode out early to check his traps. He left Micah at the cabin. Josie walked out onto the porch. The air was crisp. The sky was an impossible, endless blue. She saw Micah down by the corral. He was brushing a chestnut mare. He moved with a practiced, easy rhythm. Josie walked down the dirt path. She leaned against the wooden rails of the fence. Good morning, Micah, she said. Micah paused. He looked at her. He gave a small nod. Morning, Miss Josie. He went back to brushing. He was a quiet kid. He carried a heavy caution around him, a caution built from years of being told he didn't belong. Josie watched him work. You have a good hand with her. Elias taught me, Micah said. Says you don't break a horse. You convince it. You show it that you're not going to hurt it. Then it lets you ride. Elias is a smart man. Josie smiled. She picked up a dry, broken branch from the ground. She twirled it in her fingers. Micah, do you know how to read? Micah stopped brushing. His shoulders tensed. He looked down at the dirt. No, ma'am. Do you want to learn? Micah looked up. He looked at her face. He was looking for the trick. There was always a trick when white folks offered him something. Why? Because reading is power, Josie said simply. When you can read a contract. You can read a map. You can read the laws they try to use against you. Nobody can cheat a man who knows his letters. Micah thought about that. He looked at the brush in his hand. He looked at the horse. I reckon I'd like to learn, he said quietly. Josie smiled. It reached her eyes. She stepped away from the fence. She walked out into the open dirt of the yard. She used the heel of her boot to sweep away the loose gravel, creating a flat, clean canvas of red earth. Come here, she said. Micah tied the horse. He walked over. Josie knelt in the dirt. She took her broken branch. She drew a large, perfect letter A in the sand. This is the start of everything, Josie said. This is A like apple, or action. She handed the stick to Micah. You try. Micah took the stick. His grip was awkward. He was used to holding pitchforks and reins, not pens. He knelt beside her. He carefully traced the letter next to hers. It was shaky. It was uneven. But it was an A. Good, Josie said warmly. Now let me show you your name. M-I-C-A-H. She wrote the letters out, pronouncing each one clearly. Micah watched with absolute focus. He started copying them. He was completely absorbed. For a moment, the harsh reality of the territory melted away. There was just a teacher, a student, and the letters in the dirt. They didn't hear the horses until it was too late. The drumming of hooves rolled up the canyon walls. Josie stood up sharply. Micah scrambled to his feet, dropping the stick. 3 riders crested the ridge and rode straight down into the clearing. They didn't slow down. They spurred their horses, kicking up a massive cloud of blinding dust. They reined in hard, right in front of the cabin. Josie recognized the man in the center. It was Vance, Blackwood's foreman, a mean, ugly man with a face like tanned leather and dead. Flat eyes. Vance looked at Josie. A slow, nasty smile spread across his face. Well, look what the buzzards dragged in, Vance drawled. He rested his hand on the pommel of his saddle, right next to his gun belt. Boss said you might have survived that little misunderstanding. Figured you'd run back east by now. Josie stood tall. She did not back down. She placed herself slightly in front of Micah. I'm not going anywhere, Josie said. Her raspy voice was cold. Vance chuckled. He looked down at the ground. He saw the letters scraped into the dirt. M-I-C-A-H. Vance spat a stream of dark tobacco juice right onto the letter M. "What's this?" Vance sneered. "You teaching the help to scratch in the dirt. That's a waste of time, lady. Mules don't need to know how to read." Micah flinched. He looked down. The shame was a physical blow. Josie's eyes blazed. She didn't yell. She didn't scream. Yelling showed fear. Vance jerked his reins. He commanded his heavy roan horse to step forward. The iron-shod hooves stomped down, completely obliterating the letters in the sand. He trampled the name. He trampled the lesson. "Boss sent a message," Vance said, leaning down from the saddle. "You got 3 days to sign that deed. If you don't, we ain't going to bother with a rope next time. We'll just burn you out, whoever is hiding you." Too, he tipped his hat mockingly. "Have a nice day. Schoolmarm." He spurred his horse. The 3 riders wheeled around and tore out of the clearing, leaving a choking cloud of red dust in their wake. The silence rushed back in. It felt heavy, oppressive. Micah stood frozen. His fists were clenched at his sides. He stared at the ruined dirt. The letters were gone, replaced by the violent scars of hoofprints. "It's gone," Micah whispered. "They ruined it." Josie looked at the boy. She saw the defeat in his posture. She knew exactly what Blackwood and his men were trying to do. They weren't just trying to take land. They were trying to break spirits. They wanted people to believe they were nothing. Josie slowly knelt back down in the dirt. She did not say a word. She used her bare hands. She swept the dirt over the hoofprints. She smoothed it out. She ignored the rocks, scratching her palms. She packed the earth down flat again. She picked up the broken stick. She looked up at Micah. Her face was set in absolute stone. "Knowledge is the one thing they cannot burn," Josie said quietly. "They can steal your land. They can break your body. They can trample the dirt. But once you put a letter in your mind, it belongs to you forever." She pressed the stick into the dirt. She drew a large, perfect M. "Now," Josie said, handing the stick back to the boy, "show me the next letter." Micah looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes. It wasn't the wild, destructive fire of men like Blackwood. It was a steady, unyielding light. He took the stick. He knelt beside her. He carefully drew an eye, up on the ridge, sitting atop his horse. Elias watched. He had returned just in time to see the riders leave. He had drawn his rifle, ready to rain hell down on them. But he had waited. And as he watched the woman calmly smooth over the violent hoofprints and start again, he felt something shift deep in his chest. She wasn't using a gun. She wasn't fighting with fists. She was fighting with dignity. She was fighting by refusing to let them take away her humanity, or the humanity of the boy beside her. Elias lowered his rifle. He had never seen anything braver in his entire life. "We have to go to the law," Josie said. She was sitting at the small wooden table. Elias was cleaning a saddle by the fire. It was the following morning. "The law in Oakhaven is Sheriff Miller," Elias said without looking up. "Miller is a dog on Blackwood S-leash. He barks when he's told. He bites when he's paid." "I don't care," Josie said stubbornly. "It has to be on the record. Attempted murder, threatening a minor, trespassing. If I want the federal marshals to intervene, there has to be a paper trail. I won't hide out here while he steals my valley." Elias stopped wiping the leather. He looked at her. She was right. Hiding was just dying slowly. "All right," Elias said, "we ride for Oakhaven. But we do it smart." They left Micah at the cabin with the rifle and strict instructions to bolt into the canyon if anyone approached. Elias saddled 2 horses. They rode hard. Oakhaven was a booming mining town. Usually, the main street was choked with freight wagons, miners, cattlemen, and noise, pianos jingling from the saloons, blacksmith hammers ringing. But when Elias and Josie rode over the hill and looked down at the town, it was wrong. The street was empty. A few horses were hitched to posts, but no one was walking the boardwalks. The saloon doors were closed. The general store had its shades drawn. The whole town felt like it was holding its breath. "Something is wrong," Elias murmured. He instinctively reached down and unbuckled the leather strap over his colt. He didn't want to use it, but he wasn't a fool. "Keep your head up," he told Josie. "Act like we belong." They rode down the center of the dusty street. The silence was deafening. The clop-clop of their horses' hooves echoed off the wooden facades of the buildings. Elias felt eyes on him. Hundreds of eyes peering through cracks in shutters and dirty windows. They reached the sheriff's office. Elias dismounted. He helped Josie down. She winced slightly. Her ribs were still sore, but she stood tall. Elias pushed the heavy oak door open. Sheriff Miller was sitting behind his desk. He was a thick-necked man with a greasy mustache and a tin star pinned crookedly to his vest. He was cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife. He looked up as they walked in. He didn't look surprised. He looked satisfied. Well, well, Miller said, snapping the knife shut. Look what the cat dragged in. Elias Vance and Miss Wright. I'm here to report a crime, Josie said immediately. Thaddeus Blackwood and his men abducted me. They attempted to lynch me on my own property. I want a warrant issued for his arrest. Miller leaned back in his squeaky chair. He put his boots up on the desk. He smiled. That's a wild story. Miss Wright, Miller drawled. See the way I heard it. You went a little crazy out there in the heat. Tried to hurt yourself. And Blackwood's boys were just trying to help. Josie stared at him, stunned by the blatant lie. Help. They strung me up from a tree. Now, Miller raised a hand. Let's not get hysterical, in fact. Mr. Blackwood came by yesterday. He was awful worried about you. Said you'd gone missing. Said a certain crazy, violent hermit took you. Miller dropped his boots to the floor and stood up. He pointed a fat finger at Elias. Blackwood swore out a warrant. Vance, Miller said, kidnapping. Assault. Grand theft of livestock. I've got deputies locking down the street right now. You're both under arrest. Miss Wright. For your own protection. Of course, it was a trap. Blackwood hadn't just bought the town. He had weaponized the law against them. Elias didn't waste time arguing. He didn't shout. He just moved. He grabbed the heavy wooden chair sitting in front of the desk and hurled it directly at Miller. The sheriff shouted in surprise and threw his hands up. The chair smashed into him, knocking him backward over his desk. Papers flew everywhere. Run. Elias grabbed Josie's arm. They bolted out the door. Hey, stop right there, a voice shouted from the boardwalk. Two deputies were stepping out of the saloon across the street, drawing their weapons. Elias didn't draw his gun. He shoved Josie hard to the right, down a narrow alley between the butcher shop and the bank. A bullet splintered the wooden post, right where Elias's head had been a second before. The gunshot cracked like thunder in the empty street. They sprinted down the alley. Trash and discarded crates littered the path. Josie tripped over a bucket, but Elias caught her, hauling her forward. His military training took over. Cold, calculating adrenaline. Where are we going? Josie gasped, her chest burning. Back street. Elias said, there's only one person in this town Blackwood doesn't own. They burst out of the alley into a dusty back lane. 2 doors down was a neat, whitewashed building with a green door. A painted wooden sign hung above it, Dr. Clara Evans, Medicine and Surgery. Elias slammed his shoulder into the door. It was locked. He pounded his fist against the wood. Clara, open up, Elias shouted. They could hear shouting from the main street. The deputies were mobilizing. They were running out of time. The lock clicked. The door yanked open. A woman stood there. She was tall, with sharp features and graying hair pulled back into a severe bun. She wore a pristine white apron over a practical dark dress. She held a heavy double-barreled shotgun leveled right at Elias' chest. You're making a racket, Elias, Dr. Clara Evans said calmly. We need cover, Elias said breathlessly. Clara looked at Elias. Then she looked at Josie. Her sharp eyes immediately scanned the bruising on Josie's neck and her ragged breathing. The doctor in her overrode the danger. She lowered the shotgun and stepped aside. Get in, they hurried inside. Clara slammed the heavy door and slid 3 thick iron deadbolts into place. She ushered them into the back exam room, away from the windows. The clinic smelled intensely of carbolic acid and lavender. It was clean, it was ordered. It was a fortress of science in a town of savagery. Clara set the shotgun on her desk. She turned to Josie. Sit on the table, Clara ordered. It wasn't a request. Josie sat down. She was shaking from the run. Clara walked over, adjusted a kerosene lamp, and tilted Josie's chin up. She examined the rope burns with clinical precision. Her jaw tightened. Hemp rope, Clara muttered. Rough weave, drop not choked. They wanted to torture you. Animals Miller is coming, Elias said, pacing the room. He's going to tear this place apart, looking for us. Let him try, Clara scoffed. She turned around and crossed her arms. I delivered Miller's 3 kids. I cut a bullet out of his liver 5 years ago when a card game went bad. He owes me his life and his family. He won't kick my door down. Blackwood paid him, Josie said. He framed Elias for kidnapping me. Clara laughed humorlessly. Blackwood thinks gold buys reality. It doesn't. Clara looked at Josie. You're the school teacher, the one refusing to sell the valley. Yes, Josie said. Good for you, Clara said firmly. I'm the only female doctor within 200 miles. When I came here, they told me to go back to nursing. They told me women don't have the stomach for surgery. Clara pointed to a glass jar on the shelf holding a pickled appendix. I proved them wrong. You have to prove them wrong, too. Equality isn't handed out in this territory. You have to plant your feet and refuse to be moved. A heavy ding echoed through the clinic. Someone was hammering on the front door. Dr. Evans, open up, sheriff's business. A deputy yelled from outside. Elias went tense. His hand hovered over his Colt. He positioned himself between the door and Josie. Clara didn't flinch. She picked up her shotgun. She looked at Elias. Keep your gun holstered. Soldier, Clara said sharply. Medicine doesn't care about a man's bank account, and neither do I. I'll handle the law. He racked the shotgun with a loud, terrifying clack-clack that echoed in the quiet clinic. She turned and marched toward the front door, ready to draw a line in the sand. Dr. Clara Evans did not raise her voice. She did not have to. She stood in the open doorway of her clinic. The double-barreled shotgun rested comfortably in the crook of her arm. Deputy Fowler stood on the boardwalk. He was a young man. He had a nervous sweat breaking out on his upper lip. He held his revolver, but the barrel was pointed at the floorboards. Step aside, Fowler said, his voice cracked. Sheriff's orders. We're looking for Elias Vance. You are looking at a shotgun, Clara said. Her voice was flat. And you are standing on my porch. My porch is private property. Do you know the law, Fowler? Or did Miller just give you a badge and a gun and hope for the best? Fowler shifted his weight. He's a wanted man. He is a patient. Clara lied smoothly. I am conducting a medical examination. If you interrupt me, I will file a formal complaint with the federal marshal in Prescott. I will also remind your mother about the embarrassing rash I cured for you last spring. Do we understand each other? Fowler swallowed hard. He looked at the heavy black barrels of the shotgun. He looked at Clara's eyes. He took a step back. Yes, ma'am, Fowler mumbled. He holstered his gun. He turned and walked quickly down the street. Clara stepped back inside. She closed the door. She threw the heavy iron bolts. She let out a long, slow breath. She leaned the shotgun against the wall. He will be back, Clara said, with Miller and with more men. I bought you 10 minutes, maybe 15. Josie slid off the examination table. She looked at Elias. We need to go back to the canyon, Josie said. No, Elias said. Blackwood knows where my cabin is now. It isn't safe, not the cabin. Josie corrected. The tree. The dead cottonwood, Elias frowned. Why? Josie took a step forward. Her eyes were bright. Because I didn't just refuse to sign the deed. I stole from him. Before they dragged me out to the Badlands. They held me in Blackwood's office. He left the room to get his foreman. I found a book in his desk drawer. A black leather ledger. Clara stopped moving. She turned to look at Josie. A ledger, names, Josie said. Dates. Amounts. He wrote down every bribe he paid to Sheriff Miller. He wrote down the names of the ranchers he burned out. He even recorded the money he paid to have the water inspector look the other way. It is a complete confession. In his own handwriting, Elias felt his pulse jump. Where is it? I hid it, Josie said. Under my dress. They didn't search me. They just tied me up and threw me on a horse. When they got me to the tree, they left me alone for a few minutes to tie the noose. I dug a hole by the roots. I buried it in the dirt. Clara let out a low whistle. You are a very dangerous woman, Miss Wright. I am a citizen, Josie said firmly, and citizens do not bow to tyrants. If we get that book to the federal judge in Prescott, Blackwood is finished. His empire falls. The town gets its freedom back. Elias looked out the front window. He peeked through the crack in the heavy drapes. The sky over the main street was changing. The bright, harsh blue was gone. A massive, bruised wall of purple and brown was rolling over the distant mountains. The wind was picking up. It rattled the glass panes. Elias said, "A desert dust storm. A big one." Clara looked out the window. "It is going to hit in less than 5 minutes. The whole town will be blind." "That is our exit," Elias said. He turned to Josie. "It will be rough. You will not be able to see your own hands. You will have to trust me completely." "I trusted you with my life once already," Josie said. "I can do it again." Clara went to her supply cabinet. She pulled out 2 heavy cotton scarves. She handed them over. "Tie these over your faces," Clara instructed. "Keep your mouths shut. Breathe through your noses. The dust will cut your lungs if you panic." Elias tied his scarf. He helped Josie tie hers. He made sure the knot was tight but comfortable. "Thank you, Clara," Elias said. "Don't thank me," Clara said. "Bring that ledger back. Burn Blackwood to the ground." Figuratively speaking, of course. Elias cracked the back door open. The wind hit them like a physical blow. It was howling. The air was thick with red dirt. It stung their eyes. It tasted like pennies and dry earth. "Stay close," Elias yelled over the roar. He grabbed Josie's hand. His grip was firm, grounding. They bolted out into the alley. The world disappeared. The dust storm swallowed Oakhaven whole. The sun was blotted out. It was instantly twilight. The wind screamed through the gaps between the buildings. It tore shingles off roofs. It sent empty wooden barrels crashing down the street. They reached the hitching post behind the bank. Their horses were terrified. They were stamping their hooves, pulling hard against the reins. Elias grabbed his gelding. He stroked the horse's neck. He whispered into its ear. He didn't use commands. He used comfort. The horse steadied. He helped Josie into her saddle. He swung up onto his own. "Keep your horse right against my flank," Elias shouted. He spurred his horse forward. They rode out of the alley. The main street was pure chaos. Men were shouting. Doors were slamming. No one was looking for fugitives. They were just trying to survive the choking dirt. Elias and Josie rode straight through the center of town. They were invisible. 2 ghosts moving through a wall of moving earth. They cleared the town limits. The open desert was worse. There were no buildings to break the wind. The gale hit them with full force. It felt like being scrubbed with sandpaper. Elias navigated by memory. He knew the dip of the land. He knew the slope of the hills. He felt the terrain through the hooves of his horse. They rode for an hour. It felt like 10. The dust seeped into their clothes. It coated their hair. It made every breath a conscious, difficult effort. Josie swayed in the saddle. The exhaustion was catching up to her. Her bruised throat throbbed with every heartbeat, but she didn't complain. She kept her hands wrapped tightly around the reins. She kept her eyes on the dark shape of Elias's back. He was her anchor in the storm. Elias felt the ground steepen. They were entering the rocky foothills. The wind broke slightly against the tall sandstone formations. He squinted through the flying dirt. He was looking for a specific landmark, a jagged spire of rock that looked like a broken tooth. He found it. He turned his horse hard to the left. He led Josie down a narrow, hidden ravine. The walls closed in. The screaming wind instantly became a dull roar above them. The air down here was still thick with dust, but it was breathable. Elias stopped his horse. He dismounted. He walked back to Josie and helped her down. She practically collapsed into his arms. "I have you," Elias said. He supported her weight. He led her deeper into the ravine. The rock wall opened up. It formed a shallow, natural cave. It was dry. It was sheltered. They stepped inside. The storm raged outside, but the cave was a sanctuary. Elias sat Josie down on the sandy floor. She pulled the scarf down from her face. She coughed violently. "We made it," Elias said. He pulled off his own scarf. His face was caked with red dirt, except for the clean lines around his eyes. "Are we safe?" Josie rasped. "For tonight," Elias said. He looked out into the howling brown void. "Blackwood can't track us in this. Nobody can. We wait out the storm. Tomorrow, we go find that book." The storm did not break. It raged through the late afternoon and deep into the night. The cave was completely dark. Elias moved by touch. He gathered dry brush and twisted sage that had blown into the back of the ravine. He struck a match against a smooth rock. The small flame flared to life. He fed it carefully. Soon, a low, warm fire crackled against the sandstone wall. The orange light pushed the shadows back. Josie was sitting with her knees pulled to her chest. She watched him work. He moved with such economy. No wasted motion. Every action had a purpose. "You are good at this," Josie said quietly. Elias sat down across the fire from her. He dusted off his hands. "The army teaches you how to stay alive." Elias said, "It doesn't teach you how to live." "There is a difference." Josie nodded. She understood that. Surviving was just breathing. Living meant having a purpose. She winced and reached up to touch her neck. The rough scarf and the biting dust had irritated the rope burns. The skin was angry and inflamed. It felt like a band of fire around her throat. Elias saw the movement. He reached into his leather saddlebag. He pulled out a small round tin. "I brought the salve," Elias said, "from the cabin. It has calendula and beeswax. It will pull the heat out of the skin." He opened the tin. The smell of sweet wax and crushed flowers filled the small space. He held it out to her. Josie tried to take it, but her hands were shaking from the adrenaline and the cold. Her fingers fumbled against the metal tin. She dropped it. It landed in the soft sand. "I'm sorry," Josie whispered. She felt a sudden stupid wave of tears behind her eyes. She hated feeling weak. She had been so strong all day. Elias picked up the tin. He wiped the sand off the lid. "Don't apologize," Elias said softly. "Your body is just catching up to your brain. It happens. It's a shock." He looked at her. He looked at the angry red marks on her pale neck. "Do you want me to do it?" he asked. Josie looked at his hands. They were huge, calloused, dangerous hands. But she remembered how gently he had carried her from the tree. "Yes," she said. Elias moved closer. He did not sit beside her. He knelt in front of her. He kept himself lower than her. It was an instinctive move. He wanted her to feel in control. He scooped a small amount of the thick, yellow salve onto his fingertips. He reached toward her neck then. He stopped. His hand froze in midair. The trembling started. It was subtle at first, a slight vibration in his fingers. Then it moved up his wrist. His whole forearm began to shake. Elias clamped his jaw shut. He closed his eyes. He fought it. He fought the memory. He remembered the field hospital. He remembered pressing his hands against a young boy's chest, trying to stop the bleeding. The boy had looked at him with terrified eyes. The blood had been hot. It had covered Elias's hands. He had failed. The boy had died. Elias pulled his hand back. He curled it into a tight fist. His breathing was ragged. "I can't," Elias whispered. He stared at the cave floor. Shame burned hot in his chest. "I'm sorry. I can't touch you, my hands." "What about your hands, Elias?" Josie asked softly. "They only know how to break things," Elias said. His voice was filled with self-loathing. "They are ruined." Josie did not pull away. She did not look at him with pity. Pity was useless. She reached out. She took his trembling, closed fist in both of her hands. Elias flinched, but he didn't pull away. Her hands were small, but her grip was firm. She slowly uncurled his fingers. She traced the deep scars across his knuckles. "These hands cut me down from a tree," Josie said. Her voice was steady. "It cut through the howling wind outside. These hands built a safe place for a lost boy. These hands made a fire to keep me warm." She looked directly into his eyes. "You are not ruined, Elias," she said. "You are just carrying too much weight." Elias looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the intelligence in her eyes. He saw the fierce, unbending strength. She did not view him as a broken soldier. She viewed him as an equal, a human being worthy of grace. "I don't want to hurt you," Elias breathed. "I am not made of glass," Josie replied. "And you are not a monster. Now, put the medicine on." She guided his hand up to her neck. Elias took a shaky breath. He let go of the memory. He focused entirely on the present moment. He focused on the warmth of her skin. He applied the salve. His touch was incredibly light, barely a whisper, against her bruised flesh. He worked the medicine into the angry burns. He traced the terrible line the rope had left. The trembling stopped. The simple act of healing replaced the memory of violence. He felt the tension leave Josie's shoulders. The medicine was working. He finished. He slowly lowered his hand, but he did not move away. They were very close. The firelight danced across their faces. The wind screamed outside. But inside the cave, there was only the quiet sound of their breathing. Elias looked at her lips. He felt a sudden, desperate pull, a profound craving for connection. It had been years since he had allowed himself to feel anything but guilt. Josie looked up at him. She saw the hesitation in his eyes. She saw the deep, lonely ache. She didn't wait for him to figure it out. She leaned forward. She pressed her lips against his. It was not a frantic kiss. It was slow. It was deliberate. It was a mutual agreement. Elias closed his eyes. He brought his hands up. He cupped her face. He touched her with absolute reverence. He kissed her back. It felt like waking up. It felt like rain after a 10-year drought. All the cold, dark corners of his mind were suddenly filled with light. He poured all his unspoken grief, all his apologies, and all his respect into that kiss. Josie held onto his wrists. She anchored him. She kissed him with everything she had. She showed him that he was safe. They broke apart slowly. They stayed close, resting their foreheads together. "You are a good man, Elias Vance," Josie whispered against his mouth. Elias opened his eyes. He looked at her. For the first time since the war, he actually believed it. "Get some sleep," Elias said softly. "Tomorrow. We finish this." Josie lay down on the blanket. Elias spread out near the fire. Elias sat against the rock wall. He kept watch, but he did not fight the ghosts that night. The ghosts were gone. The morning broke cold and painfully clear. The dust storm had blown itself out. The wind was gone. The desert was completely still. The sky was a vibrant, washed clean blue. Every rock, every cactus, looked sharp and defined. Elias kicked dirt over the embers of the fire. They saddled the horses in silence. It was a comfortable silence. The air between them had shifted. The walls were down. They rode out of the ravine. The terrain had changed. The storm had rearranged the dunes. It had wiped away all old tracks. It was a fresh slate. "How far to the tree?" Elias asked. 2 miles, Josie said. She pointed toward a jagged ridge in the distance. "It sits at the end of a box canyon behind that ridge. There is only one way in." Elias frowned. A box canyon. High walls, dead end. It was a natural trap. A terrible place to get cornered. "We get in, we dig it up, we ride out fast," Elias said. They pushed the horses into a steady trot. The sun climbed higher. The chill burned off, replaced by the familiar, baking heat of the Badlands. They rounded the ridge. The canyon opened up before them. The walls were sheer red sandstone. They rose 100 feet straight up on 3 sides. The canyon floor was wide and sandy, dotted with scrub brush, and right at the back, pressing against the dead-end wall, stood the skeletal shape of the dead cottonwood tree. The frayed end of the rope was still hanging from the branch. It fluttered slightly in the breeze. Josie stared at the tree. Her hands tightened on the reins. She forced herself to breathe. She refused to let the fear take root again. "Let's get it done," Josie said. They rode into the canyon. The sound of the hooves echoed off the rock walls. It felt entirely too loud. Elias kept his eyes moving. He scanned the rim of the canyon. He scanned the shadows. He didn't like it. His instincts were screaming. They reached the tree. They dismounted. Josie walked straight to the base of the trunk. She dropped to her knees. "Here," she said, "between these 2 large roots." Elias knelt beside her. They didn't have shovels. They used their hands and flat stones. They dug frantically. The dirt was packed hard by the storm, but they tore at it. 2 feet down, Elias's fingers hit something soft. He cleared the dirt away. It was an oilcloth bundle, tied with leather twine. Josie grabbed it. She pulled it out of the hole. She untied the twine and folded back the heavy canvas. Inside sat a thick black leather book. The pages were slightly yellowed, filled with tight, meticulous handwriting. "You found it," Elias breathed. Josie clutched the ledger to her chest. A fierce smile broke across her face. "Now we have him. Now we can prove." "Prove what?" "Exactly," a voice called out. The voice boomed down the canyon. It was loud, confident, and dripping with arrogance. Elias spun around. He stepped in front of Josie instantly. His hand hovered over his holster. At the mouth of the box canyon, blocking the only exit, sat 5 men on horseback. Thaddeus Blackwood was in the center. He was a large man. He wore a tailored gray suit that looked completely out of place in the desert. He wore a silver pocket watch chain. He sat on a massive black stallion. Vance, the foreman, sat to his right, grinning a missing-tooth smile. 3 other hired guns fanned out. their rifles already drawn and resting across their saddles. "Did you really think a little dust storm would hide you?" Blackwood called out. He urged his horse forward a few paces. "I own the land, Miss Wright. I know every rock and every ravine. And I knew you would come back to the scene of the crime. The only crime here is yours." "Blackwood," Josie shouted back. She stepped out from behind Elias. She held the black ledger up high. "I have your book. I have the names of the judges you bought. I have the price you paid for the lives you ruined." Blackwood laughed. It was a cold, hollow sound. "A book is just paper, my dear," Blackwood said. "It burns. Just like your precious little schoolhouse is going to burn." He looked at Elias. "Vance told me you've gone soft." "Elias," Blackwood sneered, "said you wouldn't draw your gun. Said you lost your nerve in the war. It's a shame. You used to be a very effective killer." Elias stood perfectly still. He looked at the 5 men. He calculated the distance. He calculated the angle of the sun. He looked at the rifles. "I didn't lose my nerve, Thaddeus," Elias said quietly. His voice carried perfectly in the echo of the canyon. "I just realized that killing ignorant men doesn't solve anything." "Ignorant," Blackwood scoffed. "I am building the future. Railroads, cattle empires, towns. You and the schoolmarm are just standing in the way of progress. You think that book matters. Power isn't written on paper. Power is numbers. Power is money. I can buy 100 ledgers. I can buy 100 judges. You can't buy people," Josie yelled. "A person's rights are not for sale." Blackwood's face hardened. The amusement vanished. He looked at her with pure, unadulterated hatred. "Everything is for sale," Blackwood snapped, "and you have overstayed your welcome." He turned to Vance. "Kill the cowboy," Blackwood ordered casually. "Take the book. Bring the woman to me. I'll make sure she signs the deed before we leave her here permanently." Vance raised his rifle. The 3 other men raised theirs. Elias did not draw his gun. To draw was to engage in their game. To draw was to try and beat 5 rifles with 1 revolver. He would die. Josie would die. The ledger would burn. He had to think differently. He had to be smarter than the violence. Elias looked up. He looked at the sheer walls of the canyon. During the ride in, he had noticed something. Up on the rim, high above the canyon floor, the wild mustangs grazed on the sparse winter-fat grass. He had seen the dust from their hooves near the edge. Elias took a deep breath. He didn't reach for his Colt. He reached to his saddlebag. He pulled out the heavy brass-cased flare gun he kept for emergencies. "What is he doing?" Vance muttered. "Hesitating," Blackwood roared. Elias aimed the flare gun straight up at the canyon rim. He pulled the trigger. The red flare shot upward. It drew a burning line across the blue sky. It arced high over the sandstone rim and exploded with a blinding flash and a shrieking whistle. Silence hung in the canyon for exactly 1 second. Then the earth began to shake. It started as a low rumble, a vibration you could feel in the soles of your boots. It grew louder. It turned into thunder. Thaddeus Blackwood looked up. His arrogant sneer vanished. Over the edge of the canyon rim, a wave of brown and black crested the skyline. Wild mustangs, dozens of them, spooked by the explosion. Blind with panic, they poured over the lip of the canyon. They did not fall. They hit the steep, loose shale of the canyon walls and slid downward, kicking up massive plumes of red dirt. They were an avalanche of muscle and hooves. The dust hit the canyon floor like a tidal wave. It instantly swallowed the sun. It swallowed Blackwood and his men. Chaos erupted. Vance's horse reared up, terrified by the thunderous noise. Vance shouted, pulling hard on the reins. He fired his rifle blindly into the thick dust. The bullet chipped the rock wall 10 feet above Elias' head. Elias did not draw his gun. He used the chaos. He lunged through the blinding dirt. He tackled Vance right out of the saddle. They hit the sandy floor hard. Vance swung his heavy fists. He was a brawler, but Elias was a soldier. Elias blocked a wild punch. He drove his knee into Vance's stomach. The breath left Vance in a violent rush. Elias grabbed the man's collar, hauled him up, and slammed him against the trunk of the dead cottonwood. Vance slumped to the ground, out cold. Elias took Vance's rifle and threw it into the brush, 1 down. The mustangs reached the canyon floor. They were running blind, desperate to escape the enclosed space. They crashed into Blackwood's remaining men. Horses slammed against horses. Men shouted in terror. Two of the hired guns were thrown from their saddles. They scrambled toward the canyon walls, covering their heads, abandoning the fight completely to survive the stampede. The dust was suffocating. It was thick and gritty. Elias stayed low. He kept moving. He had to find Josie. Josie, Elias yelled over the roar of the horses. Here a voice called back. She was crouched near the roots of the tree. She had her arms wrapped tightly around the black ledger. She was coughing, but she was unhurt. Elias reached her. He grabbed her shoulder. Stay down. Suddenly, the wind shifted. A brief gap opened in the thick curtain of red dust. Through the gap, Elias saw him. Thaddeus Blackwood was still on his black stallion. The massive horse was fighting him, but Blackwood was a brutal rider. He yanked the bit, forcing the animal to stand still. Blackwood saw Josie. He saw the ledger. His face twisted into pure malice. He drew his silver-plated revolver. He leveled it straight at Josie's chest. There was no time to tackle him. There was no time to run. Elias stood up. He stepped squarely between Josie and the gun. His right hand dropped to his hip. The movement was a blur. It was pure muscle memory, stripped of all the fear and all the ghosts. He drew the Colt. He did not tremble. He did not hesitate. Elias fired one single shot. The bullet crossed the distance in a fraction of a second. It hit Blackwood's revolver exactly as he was pulling the trigger. The impact shattered the silver gun. The metal exploded in Blackwood's hand. Blackwood screamed. It was a high, jagged sound of absolute agony. He dropped the ruined weapon. He gripped his mangled, bleeding hand against his chest. The shock made him kick his spurs. His stallion bucked wildly, throwing Blackwood hard into the dirt. The gunshot echoed and faded. The Mustangs streamed out of the canyon mouth, taking the thunder with them. The dust began to settle. Elias walked forward. He kept his Colt aimed down, but ready. Blackwood lay in the dirt, writhing. His expensive gray suit was ruined. He looked up at Elias. His eyes were wide with shock and pain. You broke my hand, Blackwood gasped, spitting blood and dirt. You ruined me. Elias stood over him. He looked down at the man who had ordered a woman to be hanged. I disarmed you, Elias said coldly. I let you live. Because killing you makes me just like you, and I refuse to be anything like you. Josie walked up beside Elias. She looked down at Blackwood. She felt no pity. She felt only a profound sense of closure. You thought power was a gun and a rope, Josie said. Her raspy voice carried absolute authority. But true power is the law, and right now the law is written in this book. She held up the ledger. Tie him up, Elias, Josie said. We are going back to town. Elias holstered his Colt. His hands were completely steady. The ride back to Oakhaven was slow. Blackwood sat slumped on his horse. His mangled hand was wrapped tightly in a strip of his own torn shirt. He did not speak. The arrogance had bled right out of him. Vance and the two hired guns rode behind him, their hands bound securely with heavy leather straps. Elias rode at the front. Josie rode right beside him. The black ledger rested safely in her saddlebag. The sun was dropping low by the time they crested the hill overlooking Oakhaven. The town had survived the dust storm. Men were out with brooms, sweeping the boardwalks. Women were beating the dust out of rugs on their front porches. People stopped what they were doing as Elias and Josie rode down the main street. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Men stepped out of the saloon. Miners leaned out of the second-story windows. They saw the great Thaddeus Blackwood tied up like a common rustler. They saw the blood. They saw the grim, unyielding look on Elias Vance's face. The fear that had held Oakhaven in a chokehold began to crack. They reached the sheriff's office. Elias dismounted. He pulled Blackwood down from the saddle. Blackwood stumbled, his knees weak. The door to the office banged open. Sheriff Miller stepped out onto the boardwalk. He had a shotgun in his hands. What in the hell is this? Miller shouted. He aimed the shotgun at Elias. Let him go, Vance. You are a dead man. Put it down, Miller, Elias said. He didn't even reach for his gun. He just stared the sheriff down. I said, let him go, Miller barked, his face turning red. He's not going to do that, Sheriff. The voice came from across the street. Dr. Clara Evans stepped off the porch of her clinic. She was not Alone, behind her stood three men wearing long dusters and silver stars. U.S. Marshals. Clara had not spent the afternoon hiding. While the dust storm raged, she had used the telegraph office attached to the back of the train depot. She had called in the federal law from Prescott. The lead marshal stepped forward. He was an older man with a white mustache and eyes like flint. He looked at Miller. He looked at the shotgun. "Drop the weapon." "Miller," the marshal ordered. Miller looked at the three marshals. He looked at Blackwood, defeated and bleeding. The sheriff slowly lowered the shotgun. He let it clatter onto the wooden boards. "Marshal," Blackwood gasped, trying to pull himself together. "These people attacked me. They stole my property." Josie stepped forward. She unbuckled her saddlebag. She pulled out the black ledger. She walked past Miller. She walked right up to the marshal. She handed the heavy book to him. "My name is Josephine Wright," Josie said clearly. "Inside that book is a record of every bribe, every stolen deed, and every murder Thaddeus Blackwood has committed in this territory. You will also find the exact amounts he paid Sheriff Miller to look the other way." The marshal opened the book. He flipped through the pages. His face turned hard. He looked up at Miller. "Arrest the sheriff," the marshal told his men. Two deputies moved forward and grabbed Miller. Miller didn't fight. He just looked at the ground. Josie turned around. She looked at the crowd. The entire town was gathered in the street. They were watching her. They were waiting. "He told me I had no right to my land," Josie called out. Her voice was strained, but it reached the farthest corners of the street. "He told me that water and education belonged only to those who could pay for it. He told me that people like Micah, people in the mining camps, were just livestock." She pointed a finger at Blackwood. He was wrong. Every human being has a right to the water under the ground. Every child has a right to read the words in a book. Fear only rules us if we let it. Today, the fear is gone. Tomorrow, we build the school. A profound silence held the street. Then an old miner in the back took off his hat and clapped. Slowly, loudly. Another man joined in. Then a woman on a balcony. Soon the entire street was applauding. It was not a polite applause. It was a roar of relief. It was the sound of a town getting its soul back. Elias watched Josie standing there in the fading sunlight. She looked magnificent. She was battered, exhausted, and covered in red dust. But she was the strongest person he had ever known. He walked up beside her. He gently touched the small of her back. "It's over," Elias said softly. Josie looked up at him. The fire in her eyes softened. She leaned against him, finally letting out a long, shuddering breath. "We did it," she whispered. The marshals loaded Blackwood and his men into the jail. The town began to celebrate. The saloons opened their doors. Music started playing again. Elias and Josie did not stay for the party. They had a long ride back to the valley. They had a lot of work to do. But for the first time in his life, Elias looked forward to the work. He was not repairing a broken life anymore. He was building a new one. 6 months later, the valley was green. The winter rains had been kind, and the deep, well-pumped cold, clear water into the irrigation ditches. A large, solid building sat near the center of the valley. It had fresh white paint, large glass windows, and a heavy brass bell hanging above the front door. Josie stood on the porch of the schoolhouse. She held a cup of coffee. She watched the yard. It was a beautiful chaos. 30 children were running around. There were white kids from the mining town. There were native kids from the nearby reservation. There were black children from the freedmen settlements. They were playing tag. They were laughing. They were equal. Micah was sitting on the wooden steps. He had a thick book open on his lap. He was reading aloud to a younger girl. He stumbled on a word, sounded it out carefully, and smiled when he got it right. Josie took a sip of her coffee. Her throat still carried a faint scar, a thin white line that she refused to hide. It was a badge of honor. She looked past the children, down by the corral. Elias was working. He was holding the reins of a young, nervous colt. A group of 5 older boys stood around him, watching his every move. Elias was talking to them. His voice was low and calm. He demonstrated how to approach the animal, how to offer a hand, how to establish trust without using force. He looked entirely different from the man Josie had met under the hanging tree. The deep lines of grief around his eyes had smoothed out. His shoulders were relaxed. He smiled often. He had found his purpose. He was teaching these boys how to be gentle. He was teaching them that real strength did not come from a gun. Elias handed the brush to one of the boys. He stepped back and watched the kid carefully groom the horse. He turned and looked up at the schoolhouse. He saw Josie watching him. A slow, warm smile spread across his face. He tipped his hat to the boys, ducked through the wooden fence, and walked up the dirt path toward her. He walked up the steps and stood beside her on the porch. He smelled of leather, fresh hay, and sunshine. "They are learning fast," Elias said, looking back at the corral. "You are a good teacher," Josie said. "I just show them how to listen," Elias replied. "The horses do the rest." He turned to look at her. His eyes were incredibly soft. He reached out and gently tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His large hand brushed against her cheek. Josie leaned into his touch. She looked up at him. She loved this man. She loved his quiet strength. She loved his absolute respect for life. She noticed something. As his fingers rested against her jaw, they were trembling, just slightly. It was not the violent, terrifying shaking of a man trapped in a nightmare. It was the nervous, uncertain flutter of a man standing in front of the woman he loved. He was a tough, battle-hardened cowboy. But right now he was terrified of overstepping. Josie smiled. Her eyes danced with a playful, loving light. She stepped closer to him. She rested her hands on his chest, right over his heart. It was beating fast. Elias swallowed hard. He looked down at her lips. He wanted to kiss her. He wanted it more than he wanted to breathe. But the yard was full of children. The town was watching. He hesitated. Josie tilted her head up. She closed the distance until there was barely a whisper of space between them. She looked deeply into his eyes. "I'm begging you," Josie whispered. Her raspy voice was warm and teasing. "Just do it." Elias let out a breath that sounded like a laugh. All the hesitation vanished. He wrapped his strong arms around her waist. He pulled her flush against his chest. He bent his head and kissed her. It was a kiss that wiped the rest of the world away. It was a promise of safety. It was a declaration of absolute devotion. Behind them, the school bell rang out, clear and bright. A few of the children cheered. Micah looked up from his book and grinned. Elias broke the kiss, but he didn't let her go. He rested his forehead against hers. The trembling was gone completely. He was steady. He was grounded. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. They stood together on the porch of the schoolhouse. Surrounded by the laughter of the children, they protected. The sun beat down on the valley, but it no longer felt like a hammer. It felt like a blessing. It was a new dawn in the Badlands, and for the first time in a very long time, everything was perfectly right. This story is a work of fiction created purely for entertainment purposes. Any names, characters, events, locations, or situations portrayed in this narrative are either the product of the author's imagination or used fictitiously, and any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental. And so, beneath the wide and unforgiving sky of the American West, Elias and Josie discovered that the greatest victories are not always won by the fastest gun or the strongest fist. Sometimes they are won by a trembling hand that chooses to heal instead of destroy. Sometimes they begin with a woman refusing to surrender the land her father left her, a frightened boy drawing his name in the dirt, or a wounded soldier deciding that his past will no longer control his future. Elias had spent years believing that his hands were only capable of violence. The war had taught him how to survive, but it had also convinced him that something inside him was permanently broken. Yet Josie saw what he could not see. Those same hands had cut her down from the hanging tree. They had carried her to safety, tended her wounds, built a home for Micah, and guided frightened horses without cruelty. The story reminds us that we are not defined only by the worst things we have witnessed, the mistakes we have made, or the scars we still carry. A person can be wounded without being ruined. Healing does not erase the past, but it can give the pain a new purpose. Josie carried scars of her own, both on her body and in her heart. Blackwood tried to teach her that power belonged only to wealthy men with land, guns, and political influence. He believed that everything had a price and that every person could be frightened, purchased, or broken. But Josie understood a truth that men like Blackwood could never accept. Human dignity cannot be owned. A deed may prove who owns a piece of land, but no document, rope badge, or fortune can give one person ownership over another human soul. Josie's refusal to surrender was not merely about protecting a well or building a schoolhouse. It was about defending the right of every child to learn, every woman to stand as an equal, and every forgotten person to be treated as fully human. When Blackwood's men trampled Micah's name into the dirt, Josie did not answer with hatred. She simply smoothed the earth and wrote the first letter again. That small action carried the heart of the entire story. Cruel people may destroy what we build. They may silence our voices, close our doors, or convince us that our dreams are foolish. But they cannot remove knowledge once it has entered the mind. They cannot extinguish hope when someone is brave enough to begin again. Education gave Micah more than the ability to read words on a page. It gave him a way to understand contracts, laws, history, and his own worth. It gave him a future that others had tried to deny him. And when the school finally opened its doors to children from different families, races, and communities, it became more than a building. It became proof that compassion can create what greed never could. Elias also showed us that mercy is not weakness. He had the ability to kill Blackwood, but he chose to disarm him and bring him before the law. That choice required more courage than revenge. Revenge might have ended one man's life, but justice exposed the entire system of corruption that had kept Oakhaven afraid. True strength is not measured by how much pain we can cause. It is measured by how much pain we can prevent, how firmly we can stand without becoming cruel, and whether we can protect the innocent without losing our own humanity. This story also teaches us that no hero succeeds alone. Josie had Elias. Elias had Josie. Micah had both of them. Dr. Clara Evans used her position to protect the wounded, summon the federal marshals, and challenge a law that had been corrupted by money. Even the townspeople, who had remained silent for years, finally found their courage when they saw that Blackwood could be defeated. Change often begins with one person standing up, but it becomes permanent only when others decide to stand beside them. In the end, the greatest reward was not Blackwoodette's or the return of Josie's land. It was the life they built afterward. A school bell rang where threats had once ruled. Children played together where powerful men had tried to divide them. Micah read aloud from a book. Elias taught young boys that trust was stronger than force. And Josie stood beside a man who had finally learned to forgive himself. Their love was not born from perfection. It grew from mutual respect, shared courage, and the willingness to see goodness beneath one another's scars. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson of all. Love does not always rescue us by carrying us away from hardship. Sometimes, love remains beside us while we face it. It reminds us who we are when fear makes us forget. It gives us the